Welcome to the Freelance Journalism Podcast. I'm Katherine Reynolds Lewis, the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, and I am thrilled to launch this podcast with an especially valuable episode for all the independent journalists and creators out there. There's possibly no bigger platform than the New York Times, and so many people wonder, how do you get a guest essay or some freelance contribution into the opinion section of the Times? Well, today we have your answers. And as often is the case, the answer is hard work, continue trying, and be the expert voice. Have a very good reason for why you're the one who should be picked. Hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to the show. I'm so thrilled to be here today. I'm Katherine Reynolds Lewis, the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, whose mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelancers of color. And today I am thrilled to be talking to Katie Kingsbury, who leads the opinion report for the New York Times. She first joined the Times in 2017 as deputy editorial page editor and previously worked for the Boston Globe, where she last served as managing editor, and before that, Time Magazine. Her bio is so impressive and will be in the show notes, but just as a highlight, she's won a Pulitzer, been a Pulitzer finalist, and edited Pulitzer-winning editorial packages. Thank you so much for being here, Kate. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Katherine. I'm thrilled to be here.
Can you share what you oversee for the Times, describe the opinion report, and what kinds of contributions and more that you're looking for from independent journalists?
Of course. So as the head of opinion, I oversee our staff columnists. Those are household names like Maureen Dowd, Tom Friedman, Jamel Bowie, the list goes on. And then I oversee our editorial board, which is the institutional voice of the New York Times. I oversee things like letters to the editor and the enormous number of comments that opinion gets every day. And then I oversee guest essays, which are pieces that we most often go out and commission to bring in either expertise or experience on news events or on ideas that we think our audience should be having conversations around. I also have a graphics team, audio team, video team, design team, a newsletter team, all the elements of a digital newsroom under my remit as well. You probably know this, but the Times opinion is obviously, we, as I said, have in-house writers and the editorial board, but a large portion of what we do day in and day out are freelance pieces. If you don't know, the New York Times invented the modern op-ed page in 1970. It was really meant to be, from its conception, an opportunity to bring in outside voices that were in dialogue with, and sometimes in tension with, our editorial page. It was a print conceit at the time. Op-ed stands for the page opposite of the editorial page. We have, in the last few years, in 2021, we started examining this concept of op-ed, which had become increasingly print jargon. And we did some research with our audience, and we found that they really wanted to understand the relationship between our what we now call guest essay writers and the New York Times. Guest essays was a term that we found really more quickly and clearly communicated that relationship. But to kind of get back to your specific question, we publish between 1 and 3 guest essays every day from outside writers. We also have a small group of what we call contributing opinion writers who write for us regularly but aren't on our staff. Those people are chosen for their area of expertise, and that roster is something that changes annually based on kind of what our needs of the section are. We also commissioned photography, illustrations, and art from outside artists to accompany our work. We do something called audio shorts, where we will bring outside writers and other talents in to do short audio pieces. And then our video team works very closely with freelancers, often specifically with our op-docs series, which is a series of films by outside filmmakers.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And what would you say is the ratio or any rough guess about how many pieces you commission versus come over the transom as a pitch?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll start by saying that the best way to get a pitch read for us is to submit it via our portal, which is newyorktimes.com/guest essay. There is always going to be someone who is reading the pitch that way and making sure it's getting into the hands of the right editor. But you're right, a lot of our essays, most of our essays are now commissioned, and there's no one ideal way to pitch. We publish such a broad range of pieces and work. And I think there's something about opinion journalism specifically. Often it's hard to know what we're going to publish and what we are going to see as successful just from a pitch. It often has to go through the process of working with an editor and being realized through that process. And of course, every editor and writer works differently. And, I think that one thing I always tell people is you don't necessarily need to send in a fully written piece, especially if you're doing something like an 800 to 1,000 word essay. The one exception to that is if you're trying to write something right off the news. In that case, not only should you be sending in a fully written piece for us to consider, you should be available for edits within hours of pitching it. For more evergreen or longer form pieces, the editing conversation usually takes, it can be days, but more often it's weeks or months in the process. And so, I wouldn't recommend just sending a scattershot identical pitch to 5 editors. It probably isn't going to break through, especially if it's kind of a cookie cutter formatted piece. But I do think that, and I'll finish here, there are 3 things that are important to keep in mind when you're publishing or pitching Times opinion especially, or actually really anywhere, which is it's important to understand and keep the publication's audience in mind. It's really important to be familiar with the general style of the Times and the tone. And then be sure that what you're pitching is not something that we've already published, especially recently. That often happens where we'll publish a piece about, sperm whales, and then I will receive many, many more pitches about sperm whales. But the likelihood that we're going to be publishing multiple pieces about sperm whales right on the top of each other is pretty slim.
Got it. And what do you think is sort of an ideal pitch that's not a full essay, but gives enough of the meat to get someone's interest?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd say a couple of paragraphs. And the key things that I would include in that pitch is explain the why now, right? Especially if you are trying to write right off of a news event. I think that having that right at the top of a pitch is important. The second thing I would say is why you? Why are you the writer? Whether it's from your research that you've done or your lived experience or reporting that you've done. And then I think the third element, especially when you haven't worked with the Times before, to include is what makes you uniquely suited to write that piece in terms of, what is the unexpected take in what you're trying to say. That's often the kind of piece that we will take over the transom. Is something that we're reading it and we are like, oh, I haven't seen that argument before.
Right. Got it. And what are the range of lengths for guest essays or other pieces that you might take from outside contributors?
Yeah, it really depends. And you're going to hear me say that again and again in this
That's
conversation.
Okay.
We run so many different forms of journalism in opinion. We do run often those 600 to 800 word essays, but we also run 5,000 word essays. And obviously in your first time working with us, I wouldn't aim for 5,000 words, but it's not unheard of. And then of course, we also take freelance pitches for video and illustration and photos. And so it really depends on the editor and what their needs are.
Amazing. And can you talk about a little bit of the structure of the team? What are some of the different entry points for people who might be trying to get their foot in the door?
Yeah, I'll go back to that portal. It is the best way to reach editors. And again, it's nytimes.com/guest essays. That said, our guest essay editors are hired based on their expertise. So there are, of course, some generalists in the group. The guest essays team here at the Times is led by a woman named Vanessa Mobley, but who obviously has a relatively large team under her. So, for instance, we have a health and science team. We have a business editor. We have someone who is doing culture work. And so, I would recommend trying to find, and this goes for any publication that you're pitching, who are the editors that you want to work with, who are responsible for the coverage of the topic that you're the most interested in pursuing, and starting a relationship with that person.
Great. And now we come to the topic we love, which is money. Can you talk about your pay rates?
Sure.
And what, if you pay on submission, acceptance, or publication?
Yes. So, again, this is where I'm going to be relatively vague. And the reason is that our rates really vary based on the type of assignment it is. For guest essays, the general range is based on the word count. We also pay for freelance work, as I said, in other mediums, such as, visual journalism. And there are standard rates attached to those, kind of also based on the assignment type.
So, and can you give us a ballpark, like 200, 300, or 6,000, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I really can't. I mean, it's very different per piece.
Okay, but you do pay, because I know some places don't pay for opinion content.
Oh, no, yes, we definitely pay.
When it comes to contracts, this is the other topic that really is so much more important to independent journalists than people on staff. I'd love to know what you can share about your copyright terms. If you're writing a guest essay on a topic that you're such an expert on that you might develop it into a book, do you retain derivative rights? And then what kind of indemnification clauses might you have?
Yeah, again, it's our contract terms and our derivative rights really change depending on the specific work that's being commissioned or assigned.
Okay, so you're flexible based on, it sounds like it's a conversation.
It is a conversation, and we do have flexibility as part of our process.
Okay, great. And, especially when pitching into a portal, freelancers get superstitious about, how do I stand out? What subject line do I use? What day of the week? And for some reason, Tuesday seems to be a good day to pitch. Like, that's our current superstitious day of it. But any granular advice, that you might have about, oh, well, this is the day we have our editorial meeting. And so, or this is the time of the day that we're like sometimes scrambling. And if there's a great pitch, we might just take it.
It's a good question, and your last point there sort of threw me a little bit off of what I was going to say, because I would say there are kind of two things to keep in mind. The first of which is you're going to probably pitch to the New York Times opinion section several times before you get a yes. So don't give up. There are people reading, and I will go back to what I was saying before, which is find a way to build relationships with editors at the news organizations you want to write for, and be in their Rolodex so that when news turns, as it always does, and it turns to the topic that you're an expert at, an editor has your name and your contact information at their fingertips. So I would say, the one thing we really are constantly looking for is having the right person with the right argument at the right time. And that is never a Friday afternoon. We are always kind of closing out the weekend, which of course requires 4 days of copy that has to get to the copy desk. It's pretty rarely a late afternoon. We receive thousands of pitches a week. And so you're not going to necessarily break through even on a big news event if you're publishing at the end of the day, because we have print deadlines to meet. And I would say that the key is, again, those three things that I was talking about before, which is making sure you're being timely with your pitch. You're thinking through what the timeline should be from that pitch process. The second is, why are you the writer to write the piece? And also, why is the take that you want to have original?
Right. Sometimes it helps to get really concrete. So I don't know if you have an example or two that you can think of something that came from a freelance contributor that really worked well for you, that
Of course.
Might give
Yeah.
people a little bit more of a sense.
Of course. I mean, we do such great work with freelancers all the time at Times Opinion, but there are a few pieces that I think stand out for me. So Peggy Orenstein recently wrote a long piece for us about the phenomenon, the public health concern, really, of teenagers who choke each other during
Yes.
sexual encounters. And we have a long relationship with Peggy. She's a freelancer, but we've worked with her many times. And it was a complicated topic, a long piece, and it really required the trust of a long relationship to get us across the finish line. And we have seen a ton of readership and engagement with that piece. Another piece that I love talking about is a piece called Generation Connies that we did with Connie Wang on
Yes, I remember that.
the kind of generation of Asian American women who are named after the news anchor Connie Chung. And she pitched that idea a long time ago, and it really marinated for around 2 years until an editor working with a team of designers and photo editors and our audio team, our video team, we brought it into the world. And so that was such a great success. And then we had a piece a couple of years ago by a woman named Emmy Neitfeld. And the reason I mention it is because it was a piece that when it was published, it didn't look anything like when it was submitted. So it came across the transom. She wanted to write about what was her extremely abusive experience working for Google. And it could have been a fairly typical piece talking about that. And instead, the editor of that piece, Eleanor Barkhorn, she had this really strong sense that what the piece really was a discussion of our relationship with work and what it should be. And particularly in those early years of your career when the relationship can often verge on being abusive. And yet, it's your first experience in the workplace. And that piece I think about all the time because it had such a strong idea at the core of it. We have a long tradition in opinion of doing public diplomacy and having public figures write for us. We actually turn down most of those pieces more often than not, but they can be a really powerful tool. I think one of my proudest experiences in this role was the opportunity to work with John Lewis in the last few days of his life. He brought an essay to us that he wanted published the day of his funeral, and we were able to work with him. I mean, every day it was, I'd wake up and wonder if he had passed away in the night, but we got it finished and ready to go. And it was really gratifying to see public figures like President Obama and others reference it in their eulogies for him. But I think the best pieces for opinion are a perspective that help our readers understand, a complex world better and, that challenge conventional thought. And it's still journalism. And so well-reported pieces carry much more weight than just an armchair take.
Amazing. I got chills hearing you talk about that John Lewis piece. That must have been really unique. I shouldn't say really unique, but it must have been an amazing experience.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
And, I will say I really appreciate your encouragement to not give up after the first pitch, because when I've ever had a byline in the New York Times, I mean, I hear from people all over the world in a
Mm,
way, that you don't for a lot of other publications. So I would just say to folks in the audience, it's definitely worth it to take the time and wait 2 years,
yeah.
or work on an idea for, a long time. And bearing that in mind, can you talk about, the different steps in the editorial
Sure.
process and what they typically take, how quickly you respond to a pitch and, what people should expect?
Yeah. So I think that it's pretty hard to give a specific answer to that question, but I'll give you a little bit of a sense. So, um, we try to respond fairly quickly to pitches. But how long the editing process takes depends on the timeliness of a piece. So if
Right.
it's obviously off the news, we move a little bit faster. It depends on the length of a piece. But I do think one thing that's kind of important to say is that every piece that we do in opinion is fact checked. Accuracy is our most important. One of our most important values. And so we are, you should expect, if you are writing for us, to be fact checked either by the editor who's working on the piece, or we have an independent fact checking team that works on it. So, being available for that and ready for that process is a pretty key thing.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know up front, because you just prepare your,
Right.
the story and the reporting in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So take me through, you pitch, you get this sounds interesting, can you give me some more, or what are the typical back and forth steps in that process, would you say?
Yeah. So, again, I think every editor works slightly differently. And I think an important thing to go back to is what I was saying at the beginning, which is that, our editors are based, they have, expertise on subjects, one part of their process. And I work with the best team of editors, but one part of their process is kind of always trying to see around corners and developing new relationships with writers and trying to figure out who the fresh voices on topics are. A lot of our pieces have a lot of reporting as part of them. So, once you kind of have established a relationship with an editor, often you can send a pitch that's a few paragraphs, or
Mhm.
some editors are willing to look at several pitches at once. That's a pretty rare circumstance. I would start by pitching one idea.
Mhm.
But then, that will develop into a more full-blown draft. There's one or two rounds of editing. Sometimes there are far more. And then the fact checking comes in and there's a full fact check. And obviously, a piece will be copy edited. There's a team in opinion that really deals with audience questions in terms of the promotion of pieces.
Mm.
And then it goes out into the world.
Got it. And your main editor is sort of with you through that process, or
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How would it differ for video or audio?
Um, it's actually a pretty similar process, I would say. I think that those teams obviously work differently because of the medium, but you can expect that there's going to be all of the opinion is separate from news at the New York Times, and our editorial process is very separate, but we still hold all of our freelancers, but also our staffers, to the same kind of principles of journalism ethics and standards and rigor and independence. And so you can expect that as part of any editorial process that you're in. And part of that is that back and forth with your editor.
Got it. And I know it's hard to say exactly, but if you're trying to pitch around a holiday or a calendar date, what would you say is ideal to have the editor on the other end say, oh, we could do this in this time?
Yeah, it really depends on the event. I can't believe I keep saying the word
That's
depends.
okay. That's
Um,
okay.
for something like, the next thing I can think of is Juneteenth, right?
Mhm.
For something like that, we're probably going to do one or two pieces. And so giving an editor about a month's notice of a piece that you want to write is generally fine. But if it's something like the upcoming election, that's going to be a rolling process. And especially if you want to do something bigger or more ambitious, I would give the editor a couple of months, maybe even six. Well, we don't even have 6 months left, but, several months, because that's how long that editing process will take.
Got it. Got it. That makes sense. And then also thinking about breaking in with your first
Yeah.
pitch, is there any like topic or format that maybe is you don't see as often that makes it easier to get break in, or something you have trouble finding, and when it comes in the inbox, you're like, oh yes, this is
Yes,
something
sure.
I'm actually going to read through.
Sure. So, the bread and butter of opinion is politics and foreign policy. Those areas can be somewhat saturated, although if you have expertise on a specific country or a place where there's a news event or an upcoming election, for instance, those pieces can break through. But we're always in the market for pieces that are tied to cultural moments, whether that's a pop culture moment, and you have a smart take on it, or something more akin to a piece about the way we live now. I often refer to those pieces as the piece your group chat is going to be
Yep.
talking about, right? In the magazine world, we always called them talkers. And so those pieces are actually fairly rare. People don't necessarily think of us for them, and so I think that they're something that we're always looking for. And then I think just often the pieces that break through are really those kind of novel arguments or an experience that haven't been written about. This is from our news side, not from opinion, but I read a piece yesterday about the idea of AI replacing CEOs. And I've just never read that idea before. And I was really taken aback. And I was like, that's really smart. And so those are the kinds of pieces I think that can often break through.
Really interesting. This has been such a great conversation. I would love to dig in more, but I just want to ask maybe one or two questions,
Sure.
also about the granular, um, how to get in.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying simultaneous submission's probably not a good idea because you want something that's really crafted and aimed at the New York Times.
Yes, simultaneous to other publications, no.
Yes.
To multiple editors, that can also get frustrating. So target
Yeah,
to one editor.
I would think so.
Yeah.
And then when you're pitching into a portal, often we know when we have a relationship with an editor and we're corresponding, they miss an email, we follow up a week later or 3 weeks later. But with a portal, it's a little harder. So what would you recommend in terms of follow up?
Yeah, I should have said this at the out front, but I will say that I don't review submissions myself. I really rely on my team to do that. They have a better sense of what our need is in terms of the balance of coverage in any moment. But it never hurts to follow up. And you kind of never know when you've just reached someone on a busy day and they might need that nudge. But after one follow up, I'd probably let it go. And the timing in terms of when to follow up, I think it really depends on how newsy your pitch is.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, good. That's super helpful.
Yeah, of
Well,
course.
thank you for the conversation. We just have one more segment at the end. This is the money shot, where we ask our guests for one piece of advice for our audience that helps with the business side of freelancing.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I freelanced for a couple of years, and I know that this can be the hardest part of being a freelancer. I would say try to be as organized and thorough as you can be in terms of your books and accounting and communications. You're running your own small business, and it requires management skills and when you're managing yourself, that can be hard, but it will pay off. And I'd add that you should be sure to take rests and vacations and exercise, just the same as you would if you had a freelance job. And then I finally would say just be always looking for stories everywhere. I had the opportunity, again, this isn't for New York Times opinion, but I heard a newsroom colleague, Deborah, came in speak last week. And what she was talking about is that when she was during the pandemic, she was a freelancer, and it just occurred to her that people were going to be at home more than they'd ever been. And she started getting interested in doing reporting on real estate, which she had never written about before. And she just kept pitching her editor and the real estate desk here at the Times, and they kept giving her assignments. And she was able to bring kind of fresh eyes to the topic. And now she's doing, she became a staffer, which I know is not for everyone, but often people are looking for that path. And she's doing award-winning pieces, and she's having enormous impact. And I just found that curiosity to be something that I want to encourage in anyone who wants to have a freelance career.
That's great advice. Yeah, the beginner's mind helps us to ask the right questions sometimes.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm also glad to know that you were a freelancer at one time, because I think sometimes it gives us comfort that if you were in our shoes, you might get a sympathetic ear. So
Yes,
Katie Kingsbury, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate the advice and the encouragement and the insight.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. The Freelance Journalism Podcast is a production of the Institute for Independent Journalists. Our mission is the emotional and financial sustainability of freelancers of color. Learn more about our work at theiij.com and use the code POD10 for a discount on our annual conference and other events open for registration now. That's POD number 10. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or both. You can find our free webinars and other offerings on YouTube. And your recommendation and sharing with friends is the greatest compliment and helps us discover new listeners. Thanks for listening.